Historians of Reddit, what commonly accepted historical inaccuracies drive you crazy? Albert Einstein did not fail mathematics in school, as is commonly believed. Upon being shown a column making this claim, Einstein said, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15 I had mastered differential and integral calculus. Thanks a lot, now I have no excuse for failing my pre-calc class." I'm not a historian, just Mexican, and let me just say that Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. First, that Roman gladiatorial battles were bloodbaths with like 30 men dying in one fight. I read something very recently saying that 1 in 200 fights ended in killing. Gladiators are freaking expensive and you don't just get them killed. When a man was injured, fight over. Second, that Nero played the lyre and sang while Rome burned. He was in Antium and hurried back to Rome. Source: Tacitus. The ye and ye olde is actually abbreviated as an early modern English letter called thorn that was pronounced like th, so it's pronounced more like our the oldie than anything else. Also because Gutenberg's printing press didn't have thorn, so they improvised with y. That Paul Revere actually staged a midnight ride and was the only one who did so. He actually went from lodge to lodge warning people, then got his butt arrested, and then escaped later on in the night. That most of the slaves in the triangle trade ended up in the USA. Wrong, just plain wrong. The majority of slaves shipped from Africa ended up in South or Central America or the West Indies. Just to add to this, so many slaves were shipped to the West Indies because it was cheaper to work current slaves to death and just replace them rather than give them even a substandard quality of life. That Rosa Parks just decided one day to not move from her seat on the bus because she was tired. She actually had years of training with the NAACP leading up to that action. Years of training sounds like she was the Batman of black women, trained by Ra's al Ghul to sit on buses. One thing that really bothered a professor I had was that when people discuss the Nazis they frequently label them as psychopaths, insane, crazy, etc. This is especially true with Adolf Hitler. When discussing him, people right off the bat label him as evil, a monster, a drug addict, had one testicle, basically any reason to distance Hitler from a normal human. You can't just dismiss what happened in Nazi Germany as craziness. There were rational people making decisions and running the country. My professor would call us out on it, and ever since then I notice it a lot and it irks me too. Pabst Blue Ribbon beer claims that it got the name by winning the Blue Ribbon for best beer at the World's Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. There were no blue ribbons awarded at that fair. That Titanic was in any way badly designed, badly built, or badly operated by the standards of the time. In fact, there are so many ridiculous inaccuracies surrounding Titanic that it's hard to list even a fraction of them here. She was an incredibly seaworthy ship, much more so than any passenger ship around today. The iceberg tore a gash almost a third of the way down her side, and she still stayed afloat for more than 2 hours. In that time, all but 2 of her lifeboats were launched. There wasn't time to launch anymore. She could have had 100 more lifeboats on board, but that wouldn't have helped without vastly more crew to operate them. Titanic's passengers genuinely did believe that she was practically unsinkable. When the time came to begin loading the lifeboats, many passengers thought they would be safer staying on Titanic. There wasn't time for the crew to wait around convincing more people to get in, so when a lifeboat was ready, if there was no one else waiting to get in, it had to go. This is why so many of Titanic's lifeboats left only half full. Titanic wasn't traveling too fast for the conditions, by the standards of practice around at the time. Further precautions were put into practice after the incident, but no one on board can be blamed for doing what anyone on any ship would have done the same. She wasn't built using substandard materials. This rumor goes around a lot these days because of an article that was written some time ago. What the article is supposed to mean is that there is much better quality steel available today. This was not the case in 1909. Additionally, Titanic's builders were paid on a fee plus materials basis. They were given a set fee to construct the ship, plus the cost of all materials used. There was no incentive to use anything but the best steel they could get their hands on. The shipyard had an excellent reputation and would not risk tainting it by using bad steel, which could easily be noticed on inspection anyway. Titanic and her two sister ships Olympic and Britannic were also surprisingly maneuverable for their size, much more so than was expected. Some will tell you that Titanic's rudder was too small, but this simply isn't true. In fact, Olympic's wartime captain marveled at her maneuverability, and was even able to throw her into a sudden turn, ramming and sinking a German U-boat. Olympic was the only merchant vessel throughout the First World War recorded to have sunk an enemy vessel. Galileo's models at the time of the controversy were less accurate than the geocentric models for predicting movement of celestial bodies, important for navigation. There was ample reason to be skeptical. The Catholic response was primarily because he decided to insult the Pope, his patron, not his scientific views. Church views on the geocentric system were largely based on Greek models, not the scripture. Since his parody of the Pope was done within his works advocating heliocentrism, the church requested he cease to publish them but allowed to publish about other scientific subjects. He agreed to do so. He later broke that promise, leading to the famous trials. It wasn't a war against science, it was politics. That Napoleon was tiny. He was actually above average height. This mistake is due to the fact that French inches were different from English inches, I believe. That people in the Middle Ages used spices to mask the flavor of meat that had gone bad. If you could afford spices that were traded from far off lands at great expense, you could well afford fresh meat. The idea that Columbus was trying to prove that the earth was round, or that anyone in that time period even believed that the earth was flat. Mark Twain did not say, "The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco." I've seen quite a few quotes attributed to him that are really of unknown origin. I think because of his wide range of writings it is easy to claim he wrote something. The Vikings never wore horns on their helmets. The only reason we believe that is because of poems and tales of the Vikings saying they did so. We found remains of Vikings and non-horned helmets after the idea that they had horns on their helmets was popularized. Just think about it, aren't horns on a helmet a little impractical and inconvenient? You would never use them, and it would make a great handle for the enemy to drag your head to the floor. That people who lived before modern medicine lived much shorter lives. When we say that the average life expectancy of an individual in say the year 1100 was 35, it does not mean that most people lived to around 35 and then suddenly died. It means that mainly due to high childhood mortality and death during childbirth rates, the average age of death was driven down. If you survived childhood and pregnancy, you had a fairly good chance to live well into your 60s or 70s. Of course, people died more often from diseases and malnutrition, but these were marginal factors in reducing the average life expectancy compared to childhood mortality and death during childbirth. Pocahontas and John Smith. Thanks to Disney, no one remembers that Pocahontas was a 12-year-old girl that was kidnapped by a 30-plus-year-old man, dragged from her home, and killed by STD. She didn't die from an STD. It is not known what caused her death, but theories range from smallpox, pneumonia, or tuberculosis, to her having been poisoned, none of which are STD related. That a katana is somehow the best sword humanity ever created and that the samurai were the best swordsmen. Bullshit. The katana is great, assuming you are fighting in Japan. As soon as you hit somewhere with metal armor, specifically Europe, that sword actually kind of sucks. Also, when you break down sword fighting among all the major sword cultures, Europe, Japan, China, some parts of India, 75% of it is the same crap, mostly with variances in footwork. Europeans could handle a sword just as well as the Japanese. The exemption of the American-Philippine War from lower levels of history classes. I didn't even hear about it, much less learn about it until I took an AP class. The common American myth that Jesse James was an American Robin Hood. Jesse James was a fiery rebel who killed unarmed and innocent people who posed no threat to him and robbed southern as well northern banks and trains. Jesse's murderer is frequently referred to as the coward Robert Ford, while Ford did shoot him while facing his back. Jesse James once shot an innocent man named John Sheets who was merely filling out a bank slip. Jesse James never gave any money back to people who needed it or really had any chivalrous qualities other than deluding himself that he was a southern gentleman. truth is that Jesse James was a domestic terrorist who stole and victimized dozens of people, killed innocents and aggrandized himself by stealing the success of others. As someone from the UK, I think people forget about how crappy the country has acted over centuries. We're obviously not the root of all evil, but people forget. We seem to celebrate the abolition of slavery and look at the US as the ones with slaves, when we'd been carting slaves around the world for a substantially long time. Having a huge empire might have sounded quite cool and civilizing, but we were pretty awful in some cases, especially with how we treated the Aborigines. The Tories seem to want to bring back the pride in the history of the empire, but it's something we should look at far more objectively. As a Dutchman, we were also pretty cruel to the natives in our colonies. We also transported slaves around the world. The relative scope of World War II on the Western Europe front versus the Eastern Front. People never understand or are even taught the sheer magnitude and difference. Americans are taught as if we basically were what won the war in Europe. It's pretty dang misleading. That there were 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, there was pretty much every other Greek city-state there at the time. Sparta fielded one of the smallest armies there and reluctantly went to war because they initially wanted to stay behind on their little peninsula. Even after crap hit the fan and the rest of the Greeks retreated, there were still 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans as well as the 300 Spartans that fought to the last. What really rustles my jimmies about it is that the Spartans couldn't be seen retreating. They had to fight by the morals and laws they had drummed into them. The Thebans and Thespians just stayed behind because they had gonads of steel, even though in those days they were more of a militia than trained soldiers like the Spartans, and they get zero recognition. That people say Hitler killed 6 million people. He killed 6 million Jews. He killed over 11 million people in camps and ghettos. However, Japan killed more Chinese than Hitler killed Jews. Everything was better in the 1950s. You have been visited by the cat doctor. Comment cat health to get good health and do not get sick. Thanks for watching. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.